We are very happy, as our part of our colloquium series, to have Dr. Jessica Taylor here, which means I cornered her when she raided our department on the daily basis for coffee, which serves her right for coming and visiting us frequently and working with us all in geography, because then she gets dragged into such things. But I think it's a great timing. And Jessica's talked to us before, even though she's a relatively new faculty in sociology, criminology, and law. But I asked her to talk again in part because a number of us are working with Jessica and trying to start some research up in Namibia and potentially Mozambique. So it seemed like a good time. But Jessica joined UF in 2018, and she did both her master's and her PhD at Michigan State, which she's not the only one. We have Michigan State folks with
Spartans
us.
Are around.
There you go. And we've sent our people, former grads of ours that are up there now as faculty. So obviously an excellent program, and they're in fisheries and wildlife. But Jess's focus is on the interactions with looking at wildlife crime. And a lot of her work has been focused in Africa. And so obviously a lot of interest to many of us. And the talk she's going to give today is looking at the interactions between climate change and wildlife crime within a framework and system approach of social ecological systems, which I think many of us are familiar with in terms of a concept, but are about to see it in something that for many of us, we've probably never considered in terms of the framework of that with climate change and crime and the interactions. So thank you very much, Jessica, for talking with us. And we will go ahead, and Jessica's going to share screen and manage.
Yeah, let's try this again.
I know now it won't work and you'll be mad.
Yeah, oh, hey, it came right back up.
There you go.
Does everyone see it?
We do.
Okay, cool. Hopefully this works. When I click on something, it doesn't click out of everything and close everything down. I've had that happen a couple times. So yeah, like Jane said, talking to you today about complex interactions between climate change and wildlife crime in socio-ecological systems. And I will say this is a collaborative effort. As you can see, Jane's name is on there. I've drug her in as well. Really, the effort started with one of our PhD candidates in sociology. She has expertise in looking at the human effects and human vulnerability, adaptation, and migration due to climate change. And so we had worked together in some classes. I'm on her committee. We've published together before. And so, my gosh, it's probably been a few years ago now, given all the pandemic and stuff and the delays, that we started talking about cooperating and working together to think through these types of interactions. It wasn't long before I realized I was in over my head a little bit, looking at these coupled human and natural systems, when we decided to kind of drag in Dr. Vanessa Hall out of the Wildlife Ecology and Conservation department. She is also a fellow Spartan, so I knew her in graduate school, which was is always fun, but brought her on board to kind of help think through these kinds of integrated frameworks. And then the three of us decided that none of us really had experience looking at modeling, thinking about climate change and geographical sciences. So we showed up at Jane's door and have drug her into the project. So that's kind of how this effort has started. And we'll talk a little bit more about it. Hopefully things will, all right, so a lot of you probably recognize these as two big threats that we hear a lot about, both climate change and wildlife crime, in terms of their impacts on global biodiversity and sustainable development. Really, the statistics are staggering on either side of the equation. Some of the things that you start to hear and research coming out, again, as a result of climate change, anywhere between 5 and 170, that's a million, that's a pretty big spread. Additional people will be at risk of hunger by 2018. And about 1/3 of the plant and animal species may go extinct by 2070. Again, when we think about the connections between wildlife and climate change and livelihoods, we know wild meat and fish protein are globally a very important source of food security and for hundreds of millions of people. And many of these are the most impoverished and vulnerable to food insecurity. So there's definitely concerns there. A study by Ripple and colleagues in 2016 found that worldwide, about 301 terrestrial mammal species are threatened with extinction due to both legal and illegal hunting. So we know there are impacts of illegal hunting and trade on a wide variety of taxa. And according to CITES, since about 1999 and 2018, there have been over 6,000 different species of wildlife, flora and fauna, have been seized. So it, like I said, it impacts a wider range of different flora and fauna. And this is part of what the UN Office of Drug and Crime predicts to be about a $7 to $23 billion illicit global economy. So wildlife crime is right up there in terms of serious crimes globally. It's anywhere between the third and fourth largest crime behind things like the drug trafficking, small arms, the trade of humans. So it's a really big risk, and it's getting more and more attention from different agencies. And then when you add in estimates of illegal fisheries, illegal logging, you're talking about anywhere between 69 and nearly $200 billion of a black market on every year with the illegal extraction of fish, timber, and wildlife resources. So these are massive challenges when you view them independently. However, it's become apparent that that these two threats are interacting in complex ways. There's an emerging criminology of climate change, and that's been led by Dr. Robert Agnew, who put out a paper in 2018 looking, and we'll talk a lot more about that theory and that framework. But a lot of books, articles have come out. Most of these are theoretical at this point within criminology, but they're discussing these impacts that climate change may have on a variety of crime, including street crime in urban areas, all the way to environmental crimes. Other researchers have documented these kind of what they call sometimes illicit coping strategies in response to climate variability. So researchers in Kenya have documented the increasing conflicts between farmers, herders, and wildlife. And one of those illicit coping strategies for those farmers is to retaliate and to kill wildlife that they come into contact with. And recently we have some criminologists in Iran that empirically tested Agnew's theory of the impact of climate change on fisheries. And they found a relationship between climate change perception and general strain theory and the propensity to engage in illegal fishing. So there's been a bit of traction in this field from a criminological perspective. But I would also say, as someone who comes from fisheries and wildlife, traditionally and was looking at those types of systems in the past, some of the criminological ways in which they understand these systems leave a lot to be desired. And understanding the vulnerability, adaptive capacity, and behavioral responses of people and wildlife to climate change requires really this interdisciplinary approach. And so our interdisciplinary conceptual framework draws on 4 distinct yet related climate change literatures. We have conservation and green criminology, climate and geospatial sciences, human development and sociology, and wildlife ecology and conservation. And these fields really have complementary strengths for understanding human, wildlife, and systems vulnerability to climate change and the resultant human coping mechanisms, which sometimes can include illegal activity. But why? Why should we understand these issues? certainly, we are looking at issues of climate change may actually increase insecurity, and it may serve as a catalyst for further wildlife crime. For example, the African Center for Strategic Studies reports that the Gulf of Guinea, ocean warming and acidification have decimated the fishing stocks. And this has resulted in a lot of fishers coping by illegally fishing in foreign waters. Additionally, wildlife crimes such as illegal logging may serve as an accelerant for future climate change, for further climate change. And we see that with, currently tropical forest loss is exceeding reforestation right now. And this is going to lead to a net greenhouse gas emissions. So there are some feedbacks that we have to be aware of. And additionally, understanding these interactions will facilitate a more nuanced, effective, and socially just policy interventions. And that is, I think, it's really important to drive that point home. For example, researchers, a study published in PNAS looked at a 10-year impact of a human-centered solution to reduce illegal logging in a national park in Indonesia, in Borneo. And the ultimate goal of this was to achieve a natural climate mitigation. The program actually provided expanded access and reduced costs for healthcare and access to clinics. And with the idea of aiming to offset the health costs, which were one of the primary drivers for illegal logging in the area. The program delivered nearly a 70% reduction in illegal logging over a 10-year monitored period. So the idea that when we understand that there are couplings going on, that we want to kind of look for socially and environmentally just policy interventions. And just a point to hit on as well is just that we need to also think about understanding vulnerability, adaptive capacity, and behavioral responses when it comes to climate change. And that's where there's strengths in different literatures in these areas. Vulnerability is often seen as a function of exposure, sensitivity to the system, and adaptive capacity. Exposure, of course, you have to be exposed to the risks, whether it's a slow onset or a rapid onset. This is the presence of people, livelihoods, environmental services and resources, infrastructure. It could be economic, social, and these are things that can be adversely affected. Climate change and geospatial sciences are advantageous in kind of understanding those exposure risks to these socio-ecological systems. So it really helps us to understand what that landscape will look like and who would be exposed. Sensitivity is often talked about as the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected. And you can look at that from a species level, certainly from an individual person's level, but also communities, ecosystems, those types of systems and levels. Wildlife ecology and conservation provides understanding of sensitivities at species, community, and ecosystem scales, whereas you often see in sociology the idea of what makes individuals, communities, and even nation states or groups of people sensitive. Adaptation. In human systems, we often think about the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects in order to moderate a harm or exploit even beneficial opportunities. In natural systems, we're talking about the process of adjusting to actual climate and its effects, and human interventions may facilitate this adjustment, or it can actually hamper it. And for example, we often see wildlife may respond to climate change in 3 primary pathways. We see that in the literature. They can change themselves via evolution. That's obviously on a very long time scale. They can change their spatial distribution, so they can move around, or they can change the timing of their behavior. And so this is something that, again, wildlife can bring to the table. Exposure and vulnerability are dynamic. So we have to think about they're going to vary across temporal and spatial scales. They're going to depend on a variety of different things and dimensions like economics, social dimensions, institutional, cultural, governance, and environmental factors. And so one of the things we really want to understand, of course, is the human behavioral response are of great interest in understanding these overall vulnerability and ultimately the resilience of these social ecological systems to climate change. Humans may adapt or cope to changing climate and livelihood conditions via legal or illegal means. And these strategies might be proactive or reactive in nature. And so there's been a lot of research on, the ways in which people adapt or mitigate some of these risks. Here we are interested in looking at reactive adaptation or coping strategies, and specifically illegal wildlife crimes such as poaching, trade or trafficking of wild flora or fauna. So the overarching objectives that we have for this are kind of threefold. One, I think, is to better understand the risk conditions in different slow and rapid onset contexts. And this would include the hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and the connection to these illicit coping strategies. Another goal would be to assess the scale and impact of poaching and other likely criminal activities related to climate change. So just to better understand what's going on in the system and how those things might be are possibly related. And then again, like I've mentioned before, we would like to identify policies and investments and practices that are forward-looking, ways to be increasing both sustainability and reducing impacts on wildlife, while also providing a pro-community coping a mechanism for people to adapt and mitigate these risks. And so when we really started this project, we started digging into these 4 big literatures, and they're deep. There's a lot out there on climate change, which is both a blessing and a curse. And so we really looked at a wide variety of different frameworks, while at the same time trying to anchor our efforts around Agnew's theoretical model of the impact on climate change. So this is the one on the right-hand side. As you can see, it's a very, very generalized model. It's created by a criminologist, so it's looking for an outcome of higher levels of individual, group, corporate, or state crime. And then you can see there's a lot of room for improvement, I think, within some of these pretty broad boxes. So like I said, our starting point, we started to dig in with Agnew's theory and think through what he posits here. And as you can see, this is a very generalized model, and it introduces specific theories from criminology, particularly in that second box, and posits their influence on increasing levels of individual, group, corporate, or state crime. His intentions for this were for people to have to elaborate based on scale and specify crime, right? So these models would definitely change depending on what scale you're looking at, the individual, all the way up to maybe a city or a nation state. Or a landscape, and also what kind of crime you're investigating. So he really talked about crimes ranging as widely as corporate carbon fraud and to illegal fishing. However, the model definitely has a number of shortcomings as a tool to understand drivers and spatial patterns that we see with wildlife crimes specifically. First, we kind of see this generalized model does not distinguish between various theories as they relate to the issue of scale. These theories, for instance, these 2 that I've highlighted, they vary very differently. For example, the general strain theory focuses on norms, and also it's a very individual and emotional type of theory of crime. And it's really in response to a person's immediate environment. and social environment. Whereas reduced control is a theory that tries to explain crime at very different levels. So that could be direct control at the family is hampered, the community or state level. So as you can see, there's not really a lot of distinguishing between the different types of scales that we would look at. Second, there's definitely a need to better articulate the nature of the ecological impacts of climate change on individuals, communities, nation states, species, what have you, whatever your focus is, and a need to understand the difference between slow and rapid onset events. So that was definitely one of the shortcomings. And this requires consideration of the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity of wildlife and ecosystems at multiple levels. And then that leads to the third critique, which is the lack of feedback in this generalized model. In particular, there are feedbacks, as I've talked about, between wildlife crime and hypothesized effects of climate change, with wildlife crime further amplifying habitat change, human health effects, loss of livelihood, and social conflicts, for example. And I would say further, shortages in grazing or water resources or mitigation of human and wildlife populations may generate more opportunities for crime and drive social and human wildlife conflict. So there's definitely a need to think about those feedback loops. So this is kind of currently where we stand with our generalized theoretical model of the impacts of climate change specifically on wildlife crime. And first, you're going to see that we've kind of bolstered a bit of and articulated the nature of the ecological impacts of climate change on people and wildlife. So this model incorporates research and understanding from sociology and wildlife ecology as to the system sensitivity, adaptive capacity. Therefore, it provides a more nuanced understanding of vulnerability to climate change. Further, we, as you can see, have accounted for multiple feedback loops in the system, as the behavioral outcome of wildlife crime then has the potential to affect the overall ecological and social impacts, as well as drive further exposure to slow onset climate events. And I also would like to note that you could look at this, of course, on various scales. So you could focus on an individual population or community level, or nations or regions. So it would have to be depending on what scale you wanted to look at the model. So this just shows the same kind of model with a little bit more elaboration in those boxes. As you can see, it gets pretty messy pretty quick, and it gets really complicated really quick. But this is an example of looking at the model at the community level for slow onset climate change. And so you would see we would predict a variety of things that would lead to sensitivity of wildlife, for instance, like population dynamics, ecological plasticity, sensitivity in human systems or human communities like age and gender, socioeconomic status, access to infrastructure. And we have these impacts that are coming in on both sides, and they're interrelated. And those would lead and feed into a smaller group here, identifying kind of more larger level crime theory that would support this, such as increased conflicts and opportunities for crime. And then the behavioral outcome, of maybe retaliation based on human wildlife conflicts, or poaching for food or income. This is also going to have impacts back to the system. So it's going to feed back into that system. So this is an example of that. We've kind of chosen to hopefully initially apply our conceptual framework in Southern Africa. There's a number of reasons why we would do that, not only at least Jane and I's familiarity with the area, but Southern Africa is both experiencing and projected to experience numerous impacts from climate change, including slow onset and rapid onset events. These include observed decreases in mean precipitation, observed and projected increases in flooding, and then ironically on the flip side, also increased occurrence of agricultural and ecological droughts. Additionally, human-wildlife conflicts are definitely present at the agricultural interface in Southern Africa. Southern Africa still has a lot of wildlife. And so there's definitely conflicts there. And we also have documented issues with wildlife crimes such as poaching, trade, and trafficking. So it lends itself well to looking at this framework. And focusing in a little bit more, we really had decided to focus primarily and first and foremost on the system in Namibia. Jane and I have both we have some research experience in Namibia, which is a country heavily impacted by climate change and human-wildlife conflicts. Here we see slow onset events that can erode capacity of ecosystems and provide critical services such as fresh water, food, shelter, energy production. Pretty much all the photos you've seen today so far, except for the few that I've said belong to someone else, these are actually photos of Namibia. So you see here, this is in the Zambezi region. We have this agriculture, wildlife landscape, and these things are definitely being impacted by a variety of things. And again, Namibia does have a long documented issues with human-wildlife conflicts. In 2009, they were the first country to create and adopt a national policy on human-wildlife conflicts. And so this has been at the forefront of trying to both conserve wildlife and provide for some kind of sustainable livelihood development in the area. We hopefully intend to model and better understand the interactions between climate change and human-wildlife conflict-driven events at a national level. And eventually we would like to understand these drivers at an individual level, building off of earlier work done on human-wildlife conflicts, poaching, and the complex motivations for wildlife crime. So my previous research in Zambezi, the Zambezi region of Namibia, demonstrated that most of the documented cases of poaching, especially the use of snares, were spatially congruent with where communities perceive the impacts from HWC or human-wildlife conflict to be at the greatest. And this human-wildlife conflict in terms of crop damage, livestock depredation, and wildlife-related human fatalities. Further, residents discuss the impacts a lot with me of drought and floods as both exacerbating the prevalence and increasing the prevalence of human-wildlife conflicts, especially crop damage, while they simultaneously kind of talked about their reduced tolerance for wildlife and wildlife conservation efforts under those strained systems. So we kind of had an exciting end of the year after presenting this framework in 12 minutes at a conference, International Conservation Conference. We were contacted by a researcher at the University of Helsinki in Finland. They had conducted research in 2015 in commercial and communal farmlands. These are the commercial farmlands. They also have sites in some of the white areas here. Ironically, that little projection is where I worked, and they didn't do anything there, the Zambezi region. And they were trying to understand, better understand the use of poison on farms as a response to conflict with carnivores. And while they had not really considered climate change in their models as a driver, they had a lot of anecdotal and qualitative data that points to climate change as a driver of this illicit coping mechanism. And so they're really interested in collaborating with us to apply the conceptual framework at a national scale in Namibia and look to see if there's some spatial overlap where we see a lot of sensitivity in the system and these predicted areas of poisoning. So our team's really now busy collecting relevant data to better understand Namibia's exposure to slow onset events and sensitivities and adaptive capacities. So we're kind of in the middle of trying to find what data is available and create those create some other types of ways to look at the system. Future research, we're kind of hoping that we might be able to build on understanding the slow onset by adding these a context in which we see rapid shocks. And we see that one of the places in which we could see that in Southern Africa would be Mozambique. Mozambique is a country that experiences both the chronic, so the slow onset events like, you know, fluctuations and precipitation and those types of temperature changes. And they also get these periodic shocks to the system, these rapid onset events. And I think Leandra can tell you, unfortunately, some of these are quite recent. So, you know, things like hurricanes and flooding. And again, these underlying those slow onset events may turn into a disaster when you see this rapid onset event. Mozambique is also actually an area of high concern when it comes to wildlife poaching and trafficking in particular. And so this would be an interesting system to look at different scales to try to understand that intersection. So implications, I think first, understanding landscapes of exposure, risk, and vulnerability will help us identify future areas of concern or hotspots where interventions are really desperately needed. And then further, there are really increasing tensions over the militarization of conservation and the increased securitization of the environment as a response, including green land grabbing to wildlife and climate change respectively. Our understanding of these two kind of colossal challenges and their interactions will shape how we frame the people most impacted and drive policy interventions. Will we see climate impacted communities as perpetrators of wildlife crime, regardless of the complexity or indeed maybe the necessity of their actions? Or will we see natural resource dependent communities as victims of climate change, as those coping with immense pressures on their livelihood and well-being? So really how we kind of frame and answer this is going to be really important moving forward. And it's necessary to better understand these complex interactions between climate change and wildlife crime in order to design robust, effective, and just interventions at various scales. And so with that, hopefully we have plenty of time for discussion. But that's all I have here. I can stop sharing. So,
thank you, Jessica. Obviously very interesting. And I will just open up everything right now for if people have questions. Obviously you could put them in the chat and we can kind of say them for you, or if you have a question, just pop on and put your camera on and just ask Jessica the question now, or shout out if you're in the classroom. Sadie has one, I can tell.
Can you talk a bit more about green grabbing? I think that's what you called it.
Oh, green land grabbing?
Green land grabbing,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so you do see this a bit associated with what they call the militarization of conservation. Really, it's often primarily driven and justified by either high levels of wildlife crime or maybe deforestation and concerns about carbon mitigation. And so under those circumstances, the state or an NGO or a private entity comes in and tries to buy out the land from local communities so that can be put in either a different security mode or reforested. So this is very concerning for local communities that depend on those areas. And you do see in Southern Africa, and I'm sure Brian can talk a lot more about this kind of idea of green land grabbing, people going after the land in order to conserve or mitigate climate change.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? So I'm going to ask one that Carly posed because she's been texting me because she's been excited during the talk and apparently she won't ask it. So
no, but I have like 3 maps of Namibia up on my computer right now because I'm trying to understand the climate system. Like I'm looking at the mountains and no, it was Thank you so much. Yeah, ask away, Jane.
So I was just, because I like the idea. So Carly is playing with the climate data anyway for us for the Namibia side. So she's the one who we've been going to. But one of the things she just mentioned on the text was where it would be interesting how land degradation and land degradation surfaces might interact with some of these surfaces of kind of pressure and intensity for crime. Because it's almost like, especially if we're looking at slow onset variables, because in a way, as my husband's got a food processor going in the other room in case you can hear that. But because, I mean, what we're looking at with the land degradation is kind of that long-term signal that we're getting with those slow onset and the system under pressure. And that might be something that we could look at almost as a resultant landscape, as opposed to looking at all the individual variables, because that would pull together soils, it would pull together climate, it would kind of give us a longer time scale. And have you played it with any of the degradation work or indices?
Isn't that your area of expertise, Jane?
Yes, thank you, Jessica. Yeah,
it's a great question, Carly, you had for Jane.
Thank you.
I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, in my really past life, I did some soil science stuff, and it's always great when you can get an indicator that shows you a whole bunch of other things that you don't have to measure.
Sure.
So it's definitely worth investigating and thinking through theoretically how that's calculated and how that might relate to both the abundance of wildlife and the availability of resources like water and grazing area and how that might interact. So that might be a really good indicator because as you can see, this can quickly become very complex. And so I'm sure we're going to have at some point both to think about, you know, also, unfortunately, we don't have unlimited data at every scale. So there's going to be data limitations in some of these categories, particularly hard to measure livelihood indicators and social vulnerability. So at the same scale that we can look at some of these climate models. So I think that sounds like a great thing for Jane to think about more directly and explain to me in depth. Yeah.
Yes, I'll get Carly right on that.
Yeah.
Okay, I believe you have a question that's hopefully for Jessica and not for me.
I think it is. First of all, thank you. The presentation was really fascinating. And it's got my brain churning in a lot of ways. But I was sort of wondering about the way that you're conceptualizing kind of the feedback, I suppose, in the model, because it seems to me that there might be a couple of things going on. The first being sort of loss of livelihood, that sort of adaptive strategy, making up for those kinds of lost opportunities in people's livelihoods. But then there's also sort of this opportunity structure that might arise, the opportunity for more crime as controls loosen. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, or if I'm getting that right, or if I'm getting that wrong. But I felt like there were those two different strands and maybe more when you were talking about feedback. Yeah,
absolutely. And so what you and I know that that's a lot to digest in a short amount of time, that complex diagram. So you're spot on. And actually the increased opportunities for crime are in the box that talks about these criminological mechanisms, right? So this comes from, not to be confused with environment and conservation, what they call environmental criminology, which looks at basically how opportunities for crimes present themselves. And we certainly will expect to see, and even in my research before, you expect to see increased opportunities for crime, particularly as you have wildlife and people moving and responding to maybe limited grazing or limited water resources. I think one of the earlier photographs I had in the presentation was a young man with some cattle that he'd gone to one of these watering holes, which essentially, they're not very formal in terms of they're just either they show up in the landscape and they disappear depending on the local the precipitation. So and they talked a lot about, again, if there's droughts, then you get wildlife and livestock and people all going to the same reduced amount of a resource, and then you get increased opportunities for crime. So absolutely, you're going to start to see, as people are moving around the landscape, and that's really what struck me. Again, having just enough wildlife background to be dangerous, to ask some questions, but not considering myself an ecologist any longer. When I looked at Agnew's original theory, I'm like, these are just more complex, right? So the wildlife people, everybody's adapting, they're making choices about whether they move, if they change their behavior. And so trying to capture that in a way that also captures those feedbacks. So like you said, if people really start, and we've seen in some systems where there's a lot of poaching that goes on, particularly of ungulates and things like that, you start to see systems collapse in some areas. And so it can have an impact then on legitimate users of those resources and other types of things. So I think it'll be interesting to try to put this through kind of a peer reviewed, and maybe we send it out to a few more folks in these different fields to take a peek and really poke at it a bit, because it's complex to try to bring these fields together and put it into one pretty diagram. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Aaron's working with Brian and potentially in Namibia, so we could pull him in too. So.
Yeah.
Audrey, you had your hand up, but then you put it down. So I'm just checking on whether you intended to ask a question or not.
I was just going to ask about, I read a little bit about land grabbing in Namibia and the history of it, even post-colonialism and all that, and that, communal farms are often captured by or grabbed by elite and other people. But I was thinking about smallholder farmers and communal land, and where these wildlife conflicts are happening or poisoning in the context of land access and availability to different people, different groups of people. And also about the poisoning, thinking about it, I feel like I read something about, large, like commercial farmers doing a lot of poisoning. So I was thinking about, the difference between, smaller scale farmers or subsistence farmers, and then these commercial farmers. And I imagine you would look at both of these, but I just wondered if you had a focus there or some insight of really, is this occurring in both groups?
It is, and it's so preliminary. I've had one discussion with this researcher. He has 2 papers, and I just sent another email today trying to clarify, did they use the same data, the same questionnaire in each, because they seem to parse the papers out. So the map I showed you was the commercial farms. So these are more private, stakeholders. They also have a paper that does almost the same thing, but in those white areas, the communal areas. So I think they have a pretty good data set across everything but the Zambezi, where I was working. So yeah, I absolutely think you're going to see differences in. It's not always, it's a misnomer that it's always the poorest households that are doing the illegal activity. In fact, in some places, it's very much not. So poison obviously requires you to purchase things and requires you to be able to put it out. But they did see a pretty high prevalence of poisoning, particularly in the Southeast and those commercial farms. But again, it'd be interesting to build these models and see if there's some spatial overlap with where they're predicting poisoning to take place. The other caveat, and it was fun to try to have this discussion with Jane, the other caveat about wildlife crime research, and I will admit, I'm not, having not seen the questionnaire and the raw data yet, not really sure what quality the data is, but illegal activity is incredibly hard to pin down and to document and to quantify. because by its very nature, it's illicit and people are hiding it. And you only detect things where you go, and you only go where you think things are happening. And so that's one of those things that's really difficult. So, you know, that model that they have doesn't say that that's exactly where the most poisoning is taking place. It's based on their research. This is the highest potential. So those farmers were willing to say that it's their attitudes towards poisoning or their intent to use poisoning. But often, like my research, I never ask somebody's compliance status. I never ask them, do you poach? Do you do those things? So it's difficult. And I think where we have some data, it's nice to see how maybe some of our models and what factors fit. But ultimately, it might be interesting to use this to identify where you would see potentials for crime to be the highest and go that route. So, but I'm anxious to see what they send us. So, and like all good ecologists, they also collected all this qualitative data, and they said they did nothing with it. So there's like a whole data set on motivations to use poison and all this stuff that they've never touched. So I'm interested to see that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so any additional questions before we release Jessica? Thank you very much for a great talk. Obviously, I'm completely biased by the subject because you've already dragged me in. But it's something that we're just starting off. So if some of the other people out there are interested, then it's certainly something that we would encourage people to come join the crazy group doing crime and climate.
Yeah, and it's a big, there's actually, out of Europe, there's going to be a climate change and crime symposium or monthly kind of talk that's running from February all the way through November. And the first speaker is Robert Agnew. So this is something getting more and more attention. So I think it's timely.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. We appreciate it. It's like quiet. Oh. Could everyone